Wembley, that's given us so many moments, and it's so rich in history. It's given us so many FA Cup moments as well, the home of FA Cup final. But I want to go back to a simpler time where football was the only thing that fans could rely on because their lives elsewhere were so grim. And that makes me think of 1923, known as the fourth most boring year in history according to ChatGPT, and how the government tried to control football and in the end, for their own personal gain, harmed almost 300,000 people to the point that Wembley almost shook until it couldn't handle no more, where they almost even had blood on their hands just for their own personal gain and personal power. Well, I guess today my job is to tell you about Britain's forgotten foundational myth here on Football Unlocked. Well, to understand this, you have to know the government's biggest mistake, not predicting the actual demand of the game of football. Because why did 300,000 people end up turning up to the game? Well, it has something to do with this, the Jeddies Acts. You see, the Jeddies Acts in 1922, which cut public services, ending up affecting 35% of public workers. And you've got to remember, especially with unemployment being high at the time, with an estimated 1.5 million people within a year being unemployed, that just gets you to understand that life was grim for most people around this time, which makes this quite more understandable because we've got large advertisement for the game by people like Metro, who their advertising was mainly around there being every few minutes cheap electric fares. So why wouldn't the average working man jump on the opportunity to go to a game of football at the Empire Stadium that had only just been built for the FA Cup final along with the Wembley expedition? It just makes sense for the average working man to want to come, because after all, when the average factory worker, dock worker was making £3 to £4 per week, this was a chance for them to escape their working lives and enjoy something with their families and friends, especially when the FA Cup final was only valued at £1 per shilling that they could buy at the game. It only makes sense. And especially when Bolton were based in Lancashire, a huge industrial area for Britain at the time, it only increased the demand, especially the Daily Mail recognised that by saying for the working class it was a day out, for the media it became a legend, which we're about to see later on in this video. But the main point is the working class were excited to go to what would be the new Wembley, or how the government viewed it, the Empire Stadium, which had a capacity of about 125,000. However, the second problem is the government, who lacked clear knowledge about stadium engineering and architecture, and actual knowledge really about public safety when fans were in and outside the stadium. Because when you look at the modern day Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, which took about 3 years to make with a delay that turned it into this wonderful piece of architecture that we truly know today, where instead the government relied on using reinforced concrete, which as we know today has problems with crowd movement and is faulty material in general, which has led to later disasters like the Hillsborough and just increased cost of having to deal with this. But why would the government do this? Well, with the FA coming to them and asking to use the new Wembley after the stadiums that they were using before, like Chelsea under Stamford Bridge and the Crystal Palace, where these ill-prepared war stadiums, with the Crystal Palace as well being turned into a war zone for World War I, and the Crystal Palace as well not really having viable links to public transport, that wasn't a way that the FA wanted to move forward with, a way where football was really starting to become popular in Britain. So the FA and the government had to come up with a plan, and eventually, with the government also having their own plans about the Wembley expedition, the FA were going to be able to use Wembley to host the FA Cup final. However, there's a problem. The government, when building the stadium, had no intentions to even bother about crowd safety. Their real concerns were about emulating true designs like the Colosseum, which wanted to portray national unity. So this brings us on to our third point, the problem with the police. You see, young PC George Scory that day was just hoping to get a cup of tea to clench his thirst when he got into the office at 6 a.m. However, with 1,000 police officers that day being called to manage the 300k crowd, you're not surprised when they had to call in for backups. So eventually, another 1,000 people would make their way to come and help, managing a crowd of 300,000. However, there was a problem. When the gates shut at 1:45 after all tickets were sold, an hour later, the fans pushed through the gates and made their way into the stadium. And are you really surprised with the poor organisation and ill-prepared stewards? Not to mention the stadium was designed as a grand ball where fans could move more freely. Not really an idea about seated and real security and organisation. So the police had to come in, and it just ended up being that even 10 minutes before the scheduled kickoff, there were still fans all over the stadium, and it took half an hour really for the fans to be pushed all the way, and there was still chaos throughout the game as fans right next to the pitch were tripping players. However, it would make a legendary moment, as the horse you see on screen was Billy the Horse under George Scory, as with the good nature of the crowd just wanted to see a game and the presence of King George V, Billy was the horse that was there trying to help everyone get off the pitch and safely to a place where the game could begin. And he is embedded into football culture as the final is known as the White Horse Final and is seen in places across London. And this level of history was then as well, as 90 newspapers just around the final ended up covering the final. So it was definitely a memorable moment, somewhat for the right reasons. However, the question I should probably be asking, would I blame the police? No, because as you can see on here, police spending was going up, so the government were definitely prioritising giving the police more money to spend on many different things. So I really think you have to start putting the blame on the government and the people in charge at the time. As when it came to planning for the stadium, giving the stadium to the FA so late, and the entire construction being 300 days, which is under a year, you just start to realise that they only cared about the benefit that the stadium could give to them, not to the people and the safety of the people. The safety went out the window, and that put the people in danger who were just trying to escape out of their daily lives of just sometimes probably working. And when public safety goes out the window, there's a chance that blood could drop onto your hands. And it's a dangerous way, and it really just reminds me of the Super League, where the fans, for a different reason, felt threatened by the European elites, but also more likely like the Copa America, where poor organisation from CONMEBOL put fans all across South America, but mainly Colombia and Argentina, in sheer danger as fans and children feared for their lives. However, there being no deaths, 1,000 casualties, you have to question what really happened at the 1923 FA Cup final, Britain's forgotten foundational myth, because that ended up changing how Wembley was viewed, because Wembley ended up being changed to be more safe in the future, but this was the catalyst, really, for that. And while it had very memorable moments like Billy and George, who gracefully managed to benefit from the good nature of the crowd, and managed to get a game going. Wembley today is forgotten by people that love Wembley for what it's offered for us in our lives. But yet people seem to forget or fail to understand the true history of Wembley and how it came to be, but mainly what happens when the top elites and even the government get involved in football and use it for their own personal gain, because that is something that people complain and continue to complain about today. But the main reason I brought you to this topic is that this is one of the main reasons it began, and one of the huge problems that arise from it that people seem to forget. Now, as we finish off this video, if we were to pass the blame, I wouldn't blame Sir William Hallworth, the main commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, as while he failed to prepare adequate policing, there just wasn't enough people to really organise for that event anyway. So I think that you have to move the blame. You have to look at the Home Secretary, William Clyde Bridgman, to the left of your screen, who was responsible for public safety and policing strategy, and he did later realise his mistake and did later demand better crowd management. Or Lord Birkenhead that failed to use his funding to properly prevent a failure like this. However, the real failure has to go to the government and Prime Minister Bonar Law, who failed to see the true problems in an event like this and instead looked towards personal glory. However, the reason I'm telling you this is because the true actual origins of Wembley are forgotten today among the British population, and it's up to me today on Football Unlocked to bring you the true story of this, about the true beginning of Wembley. Otherwise, thank you guys for making it this far in the video, watching the video. Please make sure to like, subscribe and watch any of the videos on my channel. And thank you for tuning in. See you guys next time.